We talked about recursion and a little bit about iteration in the last tutorial. Recursion is the term used when you call the same function inside a function, which causes repetition since repeating the function inside a function. Iteration is the term used when you repeat steps without using recursion. This video will be about making iteration or repeating steps easier for you. In tutorial number 2, we talked about most recent assignment because we talked about how you can assign a variable multiple times. A variable takes the value of its most recent assignment. When we're repeating the assignment of a variable, we are iterating. When you hear iteration, think repetition, any type of repetition. Let's say that we set a equals 2, b equals a, and then we're going to do multiple assignment, a equals a plus 1, and b equals b plus 2. And we will print a and we will print b. Here we set b equals a. And since a's most recent assignment is 2, b is equal to 2. Even though b is equal to a, b is unaffected when we add 1 to a. B is completely separate from a after we assign b to a. When we add 2 to b's most recent assignment, we get 2 plus 2. When we run the program, we get a 3 and a 4. A is 3 because a is equal to a plus 1 because 2 plus 1 is 3. And then for b, even though b is equal to a, which was 2, 2 plus 2 is 4 because b takes its most recent assignment, which is 2, at the time when we assign b. This is just an example of multiple assignment, which is a form of iteration because any type of step that you repeat is called an iteration. Now, instead of writing each repetitive step one by one, Python has statements that make writing iterations or repetitions much easier. We'll start with the while statement, or called the while loop. The while statement works like a conditional. When the condition is true, the statements underneath are run. But the difference from an if statement is that the while statement is checked again, and if the condition is still true, then the statements underneath are repeated. As long as the condition stays true, the statements underneath are repeated. We use the term while loop because the while statement loops in a circle, repeating its statements. Here, I'm writing the function countdown, which we did in the last video, but we did it recursively. And in the countdown function, we're using a keyword called while. Now, this keyword while is followed by a condition, just like an if statement would, that continually checks the condition after running all the statements underneath. We start at 10 because I'm calling the countdown function with a 10. We have one parameter num, and this is the number that we start off with. So we start at 10, and 10 must be greater than 0 because that's the condition, num greater than 0. The condition is true. So all the statements underneath, those two statements tab to the right, we print parentheses num, and we subtract it by 1. Then we get 9. The while loop continues on. The while statement is checked again. 9 is greater than 0. So we repeat all the statements underneath and we constantly loop around, repeating all the statements underneath until that condition is false. The condition is false when num is 0 because 0 is not greater than 0. And we get out of the while loop. We print New Year's and the function's over. It's done because there's nothing left in the function. The while statement is similar to recursion, but it doesn't reuse a function. There are two main parts. First, the condition. A while statement is triggered by a true condition, like an if statement. Num is greater than 0. Second, progress. You need to make sure that condition is eventually false, or else you'll have an infinite repetition or loop. For the while loop that we have written, we're constantly decreasing num by 1. Num is decreasing every time we repeat the contents of the while loop. There's progress. 10 becomes 9, 9 becomes 8, and so on until num is 0. When num is 0, it is not greater than 0, so the while statement ends. The while loop ends there. Then we print out New Year's, and it happens, and we're at the end of the function. Using iteration with the while statement makes repeating steps much easier. When we run the program, we get the 10, 9, 8 because we're printing the number where it is currently in the while loop. And then when we get to 0, the while loop is not true, the while statement's not true, and we print out New Year's. In the last video, I told you that if iteration seems easier, then you should use iteration, but when iteration seems complex, try to think out the solution with recursion to see if recursion will make solving the problem easier. Let's do another example. Let's make a while loop that prints a number of lines. First, the function should take in a parameter for the number of lines that we want. Def space num underscore lines parentheses num parentheses colon. Next, we want to use the while loop. We must think of a base case, the moment when we are done with the while loop, when we exit. We can use num being equal to 0 as a means of ending the while loop. Step 1 is figuring out our condition. Our condition should be parentheses num not equal to 0, because when num is 0, we know we are done. While parentheses num not equal to 0 parentheses colon. While loops always have the keyword while, followed by a condition, and a colon after the condition. We want the while loop to print out a line when num is not 0. Let's say that we start num with our argument 3. Step 2 is progress. We want num to be decreasing at each step or iteration. We can subtract num by 1 with each step to make sure that we're making progress to make the condition eventually false. The condition will be false when num is equal to 0, so decreasing num by 1 each step makes sense. Num equals num minus 1. We want to print out an empty line at each step because that's the purpose of our function. Print parentheses. Let's call out the function with the argument 3. Num underscore lines parentheses 3, so that num will equal to 3. When we run the program, 3 empty lines are printed out. Here, we see the 3 empty lines. Let's take a closer look at what we're doing inside the function and the while loop. The argument is 3, so num equals 3. While loop always checks at the while statement and sees if it's true. Step 1 is the condition. The condition is true because 3 is not equal to 0. Do the statements underneath. 3 minus 1 equals 2. Check the condition again after we print the line. 2 not equals 0 is true. 2 minus 1 equals 1. Check condition. 1 is not equal to 0 is true. 1 minus 1 equals 0. Check condition. 0 not equals 0 is false, so while loop ends here. While loops make repetitive steps much easier. If you are using repetition, think while loops. There's something called infinite while loops. Let's talk about these infinite while loops. If you forget step 2, progress, then you'll come out with a while loop that never stops. If we delete the line num equals num minus 1, the while loop will never stop because the condition will always be true. 3 not equals 0 is always true. There's no progress. The while loop continues forever. When we run the function, you can see that the scrolling bar is going down forever. On a Windows computer, you can use Control-C to end the program. We want the while loop to eventually end, so always remember that you need progress that will make your condition in the while statement eventually false.